today I'm going to start building the model that I use when I'm looking at Iran and trying to understand Iran. It doesn't mean that what I'm going to tell you here is a sort of a definitive statement on what it should be or how it should be understood or whatever. I'm simply trying to sort of show the sort of the means and the methods that I use to try and get a better understanding of it. Okay, and as I said in the first lecture, we don't predict in history. Okay, so it's not a question of prediction, but it's a question of sort of understanding what it is that makes a particular society or state tick, and how we can sort of give a particular sort of some sort of understanding of where it might be going. So, in the first two lectures, two of the major themes that come out are the sort of the teleological nature of the arguments that we get a lot of the time. We start from where we are, we work backwards into the record. One of the clear, obvious cases of this is we start with the Islamic Revolution and we work backwards. Okay? So the Islamic Revolution becomes the pivotal moment and everything else is read through that prism. That's a mistake as far as I'm concerned. Okay? Then we have this notion of semiological chains, okay, which is what I was drawing on from Bach about really this notion that we have built over time such a series of sort of assumptions and presumptions and prejudices and whatever you want, built upon built, that actually when it comes to deconstructing that, it's a much, much more laborious process than we think. Okay, people come with preconceptions, they come with prejudgments, they come with assumptions that are so well embedded, so well entrenched, okay, partly as a consequence of these ideas that have been circulated over and over again through the construction of echo chambers, if you want to use it that way. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, okay? And through, obviously, the benefits or disadvantages, I should say, of social media, which means that, obviously, certain, quote, facts can get round so quickly that by the time anyone sort of challenges that fact, it's too late. And we see this in all sorts of more contentious or sort of traumatic political exercises, not just, I mean, the joy of Iran, by the way, is that everything is contentious. The politics of history in Iran is enormous. You can see people getting very excited over Cyrus the Great, yeah, all the way down to the modern period. Okay, so everything is political. In a very Soviet sense, what is contested in Iran is the past, not the present and future. Okay, it's the past where they're all fighting. Okay, and it is extraordinary, actually, the level, the sort of things we think is quite trivial, becomes intensely political. And obviously things like the rise of Islam in Iran in the 7th and 8th century is also very, very critical. So these sort of things lend itself to a whole range of sort of layered understandings, myths, political myths, and then I'll get to the history. What I'm trying to argue here, by the way, hopefully you'll see, is that all these represent parts of a spectrum. Okay? And what we as historians have to do is A, recognise that. Okay, first of all, recognise it. And B, be able to distinguish what we can, how far we can. It's an imperfect science. It is, thankfully, not a science, but you get my drift, all right? So this is what we need to understand, and I think one of the things that we need to do is go to the basis and have a look at it. So I always start, in many ways, with these sort of basic foundation myths. Okay, the foundation myths, the core myths, as I've said here, but the foundation myths that shape, in many ways, the understanding of the political economy in Iran. And Iran is quite peculiar, okay, in terms of civilizations, in that it enjoys two foundation myths and two creation myths. Yeah? It enjoys two narratives which it draws on. And one of the critical things as a historian is to understand which one has dominance over the other or which one is basically influencing the other and vice versa. Okay? One of these is very clearly what they've inherited from the Abrahamic faiths. Okay, so through Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. I'd like to say that goes back in some ways to Zoroastrianism as well. So there is a certain much more harmonization of that. But the fact is, there is a particular sort of myth that derives itself from that, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then, of course, there's the very starkly sort of the very clear Iranian myths. Okay, the Iranian myths that are derived from a Zoroastrian understanding of the ascent of man and the development. And those myths are really sort of largely, but not exclusively, I have to say, largely, but not exclusively, embodied in this great epic poem, the Book of Kings, which was redacted in sort of the 9th, 10th century, okay, of the Common Era, since we seem to use Common Era these days, but obviously has its roots much, much further back into the Sasanian period and earlier, okay? So these are the collective myths actually of Eastern Iran rather than Western Iran, which is interesting. But nonetheless, they contain within them certain sort of ideas. This political myth, or it's a myth, but it is a political myth as well, again, the boundaries are not that clear, is the story of Kaveh, who is it forms one of the great myths of emancipation. Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, famously says that it's at times of stress and at times of trauma that societies and political societies tend to zoom in and refocus back on the myths that shape them. Okay? We tend to be much more dismissive of these myths that underpin these sort of grand narratives, if you will, or even meta-narratives, if I want to borrow from Hayden White in some ways, that underpin the way in which Iranians work. But earlier scholars of Iran, by the way, particularly British scholars of Iran, were not so sniffy about it. Okay, so Sir John Malcolm, when he went to Iran in the early 1800s, he comments on the importance of acquiring a knowledge of folk tales, myths, parables from the society in which you're working in, because it gives you an insight into the way they think, okay, and the way they approach the world. And actually, one of his Iranian interlocutors criticized him for it and said, why are you wasting your time on all these sort of parables and children's tales? And he says, we shouldn't be so, it's a wonderful phrase actually, so we shouldn't be so advanced in society as to think that all these things are so trivial, because actually they give us insights, they offer us windows. And I'm very much of the view that these mythologies, in a sense, these founding mythologies shape us. Now, I'm just going to focus on two critical ones, okay? You'll hear a lot in Iranian society, you'll hear a lot, particularly among anthropologists, God help us, that, about the Shia tradition of martyrdom and Imam Hussein and all this sort of thing. This is part of a sort of a tradition within an Iranian Shia tradition, which revolves around, as I'll discuss, really this notion of the myth of justice or injustice and oppression. Okay, so the myth of Hussein as a martyrdom, as a martyred figure ranges very large. And again, because of the importance of the Islamic Revolution in terms of proximity to, or the way we regard the Islamic Revolution as so important, that myth is seen as pivotal. I get bored to death of textbooks that tell us that all Iranians are really keen on martyrdom. Yeah? No, they're not. Yeah? But because they sort of like to sort of see the Imam Hussein or whatever, they say, well, the Iranians are all keen on martyrdom. Most Iranians are not keen on martyrdom, let me assure you of that. Okay? But nonetheless, there are these sort of lazy, I think, interpretations that go in. But more important, I think, in terms of the mythic cause, these are symbolic, in my view, of the Iranian and the Islamic traditions, both of which permeate and have an effect, by the way, on the way in which these political societies work. So let's go to this one, which is basically, in essence, this is a poster that was at the time of the Islamic Revolution. Let's go to the Islamic one, which is basically Khomeini as Moses. Okay? Khomeini as Moses kicks out the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is the tyrant. Okay? Moses is the leader. Okay? And even you can see overlaps basically within sort of fairly various royal cycles in Iran, about obviously the leader coming from nowhere, obviously a babe who's been discovered somewhere. Suddenly when he comes to 18, he says, oh, I'm king, whatever. And people recognize him. So there is that part of the narrative that is quite important. But in this case, in a sort of a more, the Abrahamic myth, the Mosaic myth, as Foyer has discussed it, and it permeates actually a lot of our thinking, by the way, in the West. You don't see it, but it's got various aspects to that mythology that you see in leadership. First of all, you need a leader. Okay, it is the leader, the savior, that comes and takes you out of bondage. Okay, so your myth of emancipation is defined really on the basis of the leader who comes and gets you out. But what does he do with you after that? He's going to take you to the promised land. But before you get to the promised land, you're going to wander in the desert for 40 years. Okay, now if you look at the current ideology in Iran, what do they say to people? They say, we are going to the promised land. Things are tough now, but we just got to keep going, because right over that hill will be the promised land. And everyone says, hell, we can suffer 60% inflation, we can suffer no food, we can do this because we're going to the promised land. So that's a very powerful myth. Okay, and a lot of leaders use it, of course. Yeah? Charismatic leaders in particular will say, follow me. I will take you from bondage to freedom, but it's going to be hard work. Okay, so bear that in mind. So that's one myth. Okay, and remember the importance of the leader in that. The Iranian myth of emancipation is slightly different. It has interesting tales about it. Now, in the Iranian myth of emancipation, which was used very heavily, this is actually from a left-wing two-day party, communist party sort of magazine. So the myth of Kaveh was used very widely by them. Don't be under this illusion that what I'm talking to you about here is sort of very airy, fairy literature. It's not. Okay, it's used very, very widely. My great distress in some ways is that most people dealing with Iran today are ignorant of this stuff. Either ignorant of the stuff or don't deal with it. Yeah, they're not interested. Actually, if you go to Iran, you'll find it's pervasive. Okay, and the myth of Kaveh in particular is particularly pervasive now, and it's become much more even in the last protest. But what are the main aspects of the myth which are quite important? And not all the aspects of the myth, by the way, are in the Shahnameh. You have to find another historical text in the medieval period. Mir Khan and others detail it, and I find it fascinating. So first of all, you have the tyrant king, the dragon king, the Arab tyrant of Iran. You can have whichever you want, by the way, but he's a tyrant, okay? And interestingly, you'll find in Iran, they debate about this. Is he Arab? Is he not? Is he what? Because obviously that has an impact, right? Okay? We look at it and we'd say, it's like you're arguing whether King Arthur was French. You know what I mean? It's, was he, what was King Arthur? Was he Welsh? Yeah. This sort of thing. In Iran, they take this sort of thing quite seriously, actually, because it has a political impact. If you think that your myth of emancipation is defined against an Arab tyrant that was overthrown, it has implications. Okay? So the Arab tyrant is someone called Zahak. Okay? He's meant to, he's got two sort of very painful boils on his shoulder, which obviously in nice literary style become snakes. Hence the Dragon King. He's anthropomorphized, obviously. So Dragon King. And in order for this pain in his shoulders to be ameliorated, he needs, you can see the parallels here, he needs the brains, has to be brains obviously, of two young sort of basically Kurdish people. This is also part of the Kurdish myth of emancipation as well, who they have to go and sort of rub it on his shoulder so he feels better. Okay, now they say Kurdish, it could be actually, the Kurds sort of tend to think it's them. But it could. Now, in order to do that, he has to go and get, the brains of young men to come and do this, and basically part of the problem, in this fascinating story, if you look at it, they say, Zahak went to his nobleman and they said, who is the most just king in the world? And they say, you are, obviously, Tsar, you're the best thing ever. And the narrative is very clear on that. There's a lot of sycophancy, classic stuff, yeah. He clearly needs this ointment to sort himself out, and he goes around and he sort of taxes everyone. He says, I need your son, I need your son, that sort of thing. Okay? One person says, enough. Okay? And that happens to be a gentleman called Kaveh, who's meant to come from the city of Isfahan, actually, and who is meant to be a blacksmith. Okay? So first point here is your leader of the revolt is a working class hero. Hence why it's so popular among the left. But okay? It's a working class hero. Okay? He's a blacksmith. And he says, enough. And he goes to the court and he says, I'm not giving you any more of my sons to butcher. What you don't hear in a lot of in the myths, but you'll get it in Mir Khan, is that Kaveh had 18 sons, and he only said no when it got to the last one. Think about it. What does that tell you? It says that Iranians can suffer a lot of pain, but when it gets to the end, enough is enough. Okay? That's the metaphor, the part of the myth. He had 18 sons, 17 of them, he said, yes, you may have them. They came for the last one, he said, enough. He goes to the court, he creates a big, a big fuss, he causes, he basically almost speaks truth to power. Speaks truth to power, he says, you're a tyrant. The nobles think, oh, actually, maybe he is. And you get this sort of rebellion, and it's a mass popular rebellion against Zahak. What Kaveh does, of course, it's not that he takes over and restores the natural order. What he does is he goes and finds the right king, the rightful king, Feridun, and he brings him back. He's the rightful king by inheritance, and he brings him back. And Feridun is the one who basically defeats Zahak eventually and takes Zahak and chains him apparently in a mountain, Damovan somewhere in the mountains, where he's chained for, I can't remember what it is, 10,000 years or whatever, until he obviously is going to pop back and create havoc again. Anyway, the whole point about it is, though, in terms of the general terms of it, is this one requires leadership. The leader is key, it's the prince. Moses is a prince, effectively. He's part of the royal household. He comes in, he leads his people. This one, it's a mass uprising. And the leader of that is a working class. I think these are two very distinctive myths of emancipation, and they're very powerful in their own way. But it also emphasizes the fact that in terms of the mythologies that underpin Iranian politics, they come from two distinct traditions. And this myth, I will tell you, is more powerful today. Okay? One of the things that Kaveh does is he takes his apron off, his leather apron, he attaches it to a staff, and that becomes his banner. Okay? And the banner of Kaveh becomes a great symbol of Iranian, quote, nationhood, if you want to put it that way. And of course, the Sasanians and others had things like this. When the Arabs conquered Iran in the 7th century, one of the first things they did was to destroy this banner. A leather apron, but obviously full of jewels. That's probably why they destroyed it, obviously, then. In the demonstrations that were going on in 2022 and 2019, so basically from 2009 onwards, there has been an increasing use of the term Zahak to describe Khamenei. Obviously, he doesn't like it. Yeah? And people are very wary about using it, by the way, okay, because they know he doesn't like it. From 2015-16 onwards, they've been using it much more frequently. And in 2022, there were actually younger people there mocking up their own sort of banners of Kaveh and stuff and marching down the street and talking about emancipation. This is, as I said, an important narrative, and you need to know about it. But the other thing you need to know about it is that Kaveh did not rebel until his 18th son. They came for his 18th son. Okay, so that another point about the narrative, which is very important, is the degree of complacency comes in, because the people don't do much until they snap, and when they snap, it's finished. It's one of the big sort of questions also in political, how should we say, management in Iran, is to what extent, how far are we in terms of the, that political capital that we're expending? So when will the tipping point come? It's very difficult to judge, you see, of course, but what their own sort of history and understanding and their mythology tells them is that there is a stoicism in Iranian society which you mustn't misread for basically acceptance. They're tolerating you. Yeah? So think about that. Let's go to the next layer and see what the political myths are that might underlay a sort of narrative. So let's get that basic foundation. Let's move over on one further layer. This is ostensibly the tomb of Nader Shah in Mashhad. I'm pretty sure he's buried there, but some people debate it. Marvellous statue, which at the time of the revolution was the one grave of a past monarch in Iran, apart from in terms of not the ancient kings, but the early, that the Islamic Revolution did not despoil, effectively. This one they didn't touch. Okay, Nader Shah features very heavily in the psychology of Iranians for various reasons. So, a key one, as I mentioned, is a sort of a myth of the saviour, drawn from those deeper myths But it is very, very current in Iranian political ideals. It doesn't have to be, as I said, a royal saviour, but it needs to be a saviour. So a saviour features in that. It's not tied in there with that myth of emancipation in some ways, but it is one of the powerful elements in there. I think it's less important than the ones that we saw before, the foundation myths. Okay, but nonetheless, it would be wrong to say that most Iranians don't sort of see that in terms of a saviour coming to help them. Now, one of the lovely sort of not anecdotes, but the sort of, it is an anecdote really about Nader Shah, which is great. Nader Shah, for those of you who don't know, is the great king who came to rescue effectively the collapse of the Safavid Empire at the beginning of the 18th century. He fought for its re-establishment, basically realised the Safavids were a bit useless, overthrew them and set up his own dynasty. He then succeeded in invading India and doing all sorts of extraordinary things, which even officials at the East India Company were so impressed with, they called him the New Alexander. He was also quite brutal. Okay? Nader Shah and human rights do not go well together. Okay? But most modern Iranians will ignore that bit of it. All they see is the might, the power. And there's several things about it, again, that are quite interesting and what Nader Shah represents. One, Nader Shah represents the importance of leadership, but the importance of leadership in rescuing a state that is at such a low ebb. At the time when he arrives, Iran had effectively been conquered by the Afghan warlords. The Afghan warlords were absolutely making merry hay in Isfahan, plundering, rape, pillage, the works. Nader Shah comes to save. Within the space of 10 years, the collapse of Iran and the resuscitation of Iran takes place. Iran becomes a non-entity into another imperial state within 10 years. And it's the rapid rise of that that's extraordinary. But it does sort of give this sense to people that don't worry, when it gets really bad, the dawn is just around the corner and someone will come and rescue us. Breeds complacency, by the way, because you sort of assume someone's going to come and do it for you. Nader Shah has reported this anecdote where he goes and fights in Afghanistan, or what is now Afghanistan, and he sees a 70-year-old, although the 70-year-old becomes 80 or 90, depending on your retelling of it, and he says, "Where were you when the Afghans were molesting our country?" And he says, "Sire, I was here, but you weren't." Nice. Okay? Nice bit of sort of like summary of that sort of notion of, we can have all we want, but without you, nothing happens. Okay? So that sort of element and that sort of notion of the saviour is very, very important in terms of galvanizing opinion. And of course, you see a myriad number of saviours within Iranian history. Cyrus the Great is clearly a key one, by the way, occurs very frequently, father of the nation. Okay? But there are others. And if you look around the history of Iran, certainly from the early modern period onwards, you'll see even in Safavid texts, they'll say, our empire is great, it's not as great as it used to be, but it's not a problem because we'll get another great king and he'll extend the boundaries. There's not a sort of sense that this is final. There's always a sense that this is temporary. And it's temporary because we'll get our mojo back. How we'll get the mojo back is not a matter of discussion. Something will happen. Okay? A leader will come. God will look after us, if you want. But there's a sort of a view of that somehow will be saved. Now, the contradictions that occur in there are, of course, very, very key, because just as you have, for instance, narratives of greatness, narratives of empire, narratives of resuscitation, you also have narratives of myths of being oppressed, myths of basically injustice and justice. Okay, and these come, as I said, in some ways, from that Islamic side of the debate. It's not exclusively that, but it's articulated within that frame of reference. That the world is unjust. We are here to restore justice, and at the end of the day, that is the worldview that they have. It is an ugly world out there. It is an ugly political system in a sense. You accept it, you don't accept it, but you live within it in anticipation of better days. Okay, so justice and sorry, I'm talking to the slide again. Justice and the sort of oppressed, those are in some ways two aspects of the same coin. Okay, and that's very powerfully expressed, for instance, by Ahmadinejad, who wandered off a lot about talking about how the world is very unjust and Iran is going to come and restore the true order. He then marries it with various sort of Islamic eschatology, the return of the hidden Imam and others, and mix in masses with a bit of nationalism. So he would go, for instance, by way of example, and by the way, this is the beauty of ideologies, by the way, they're not meant to make sense. They have a sort of internal incoherence and internal logic, but they're not necessarily meant to make sense, and that's in any rational way. So, Ahmadinejad would say that the world is unjust. The post-war world is unjust. And it is founded on a myth. And when he says myth, by the way, he doesn't mean it in this sense. He says myth in terms of a falsity. And that falsity is the Holocaust. And it created an unjust world order. And when he would go and talk to his German interlocutors, by the way, he'd say, you and I, we're Aryans, and we're going to inherit the world. So he mixes his nationalism with a bit of religious eschatology. The Germans are obviously horrified by this sort of type of engagement, but that's what he would say. We know the German politicians who encountered this nonsense. Okay, so you Germans, you've been hard done by after the war. But a new world order is coming. It's going to be reversed. And then just to throw in that sacral element, and then the hidden imam is going to come, and it's all going to be hunky-dory. So you have a sort of a mismatch of sort of myths, political myths, religious myths, all brought together in the service of one sort of narrative of emancipation with a save. I mean, throw it all in. Yeah, it all happens. You can see how that slides aligns in very, very well into post-colonial narratives of one sort or another. Okay, the injustice of that, the way in which imperialism, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, that borrows from the left, it borrows from the right, it borrows from religious, national, it borrows from everything, but it throws it all in to create a picture. Time is one thing also the Iranians think they have an enormous amount of. If there's one resource the Iranians tend to think they have a lot of is time. Okay, so we can take our time in doing things. We don't need to rush. We've been here, and it's derived from the fact that we are a very ancient civilization. We've been here for a very long time, and we'll be here for a very long time. So we can sit and wait. Again, I think it's a conceit, but you'll see it expressed. Now, on the narratives of greatness, I just want to show you this just to show that it's not a myth. I mean, it's not a falsity. The imperial mentality that comes with Iran. What do you think this map is? You're not going to know, so I'm going to tell you, don't worry. This map represents the claims of Iran at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. So when they went to Paris, they had a list of claims. What's fascinating about this is Iran in 1919 was in no position to make any claims whatsoever of the great powers. Yeah, its political economy was a mess in 1919. It was recognized as a state. It was recognized as a territory. And one of the interesting things about all this, of course, is the Iranian statesmen ensured that Iran was the first, I understand, first sovereign Muslim state to become a member of the League of Nations. I mean, they argued it very, very, it was the only one of the first one they actively engaged in international organizations, partly because they wanted the recognition, the legal recognition, obviously, of the state. So they played that very well. But this, okay, just to emphasize to you, is that this shows how ingrained some of these ideas are. They go in 1919, the Ottoman Empire has collapsed, the Russian Empire has collapsed, and they go to Curzon, and they go to the French and others, and they say, since we've survived time, and the others have collapsed, I think we ought to get back all those things that have been pinched off us over many years. And what do they want? All of Transcaucasia, all of Central Asia up to the Oxus, most of Eastern Anatolia, because the Kurds are our ethnic brethren, and they all want to come back to the fatherland. The Kurds obviously had a separate delegation and had different ideas, but nonetheless, it's interesting. What's the bit they didn't ask for? They didn't ask for control of the religious sites in the south. They weren't interested in Najaf and Karbala. They said, given that Shiism is the dominant faith in this country, we'd be very grateful if the world powers would let us know what you're doing and kept us informed. And we'd like to have a say. But they don't ask for it. They ask for these areas. And they notably don't ask for anything in eastern Iran because obviously the British Empire is still extant, so it would be a bad move. Okay, but they would have probably asked for Herat. But my point about this is that ideas and narratives of greatness run deep. That imperial mentality runs deep, and it's not a Pahlavi creation. It's a much earlier example, and it's part of the inheritance of modern Iran. Okay, so you know, in a sense, what I say to people is, you look at Iran, you look at what motivates them. You have to look at the level of the pull and push of different contradictory sort of elements within that sort of political psychology, if I can put it that way. At the one hand, they're oppressed. At one hand, they're leader of the third world. On the other hand, we're a great power who really deserves the respect that we ought to have as an ancient state. Yeah, they personally don't see a contradiction in that, partly because they define it as an attack on the Western world, Western hegemony, capitalism as they see it, depending on what your political leanings are. If you're on the left, you'll emphasize capitalism. If you're a nationalist, you'll emphasize the glories of the Sasanian Empire. And this is basically the model of what we would call Iran Shah, the Empire of Iran, that is accounted in many, many documents throughout the medieval and early medieval period. But it's essentially the Oxus, the Euphrates, up to the Caucasus, and if they had their chance, it would be to the Indus. They won't at the moment, but if they had their chance. If you look at where Iran operates today in terms of its near abroad, this is it. The Islamic Republic has not done anything differently in that sense. It has changed the language and the tone and the rhetoric But in many ways, it's simply following on, and this is my argument was always, the Islamic Republic is more, in a sense, the last of the Pahlavis than it is the first of something else. Because almost everything they do, and they do it badly, by the way, but they do, is they sort of lift these things up from, 100 years ago, whatever. The sheer idea of nationalism, which pervades Iran today, in a quite extraordinary level. It affects analysts, it affects pundits, it affects whatever. They all feel this acute sense of Iranianness. But what is that Iranianness? It's what these early nationalists, these early ideologues of the 19th and early 20th century have bequeathed them. They will rubbish them, by the way. I mean, this is the interesting thing. They say, well, these people, they're all West-toxicated, they all borrowed from the West so heavily. But the fact is, everything they have in terms of their identity is basically based on them. If you say that the Islamic Revolution in Iran is the greatest revolution to have affected mankind following from the French and the Russian, your narrative is European. Where is Islam in that? Yeah? I mean, some of these things I say to you because they're very obvious in a sense, but it also goes to the heart of what I said to you in the last lectures. Don't read into the evidence what you want to see. Read into the evidence what's there. And if an Iranian student says that the Islamic Revolution is the greatest leap in intellectual thought since the Renaissance, his frame of reference is European. So, let's go on to the main elements of the history that I want to sort of basically talk to you about. I did start at 15:15, didn't I? So, sorry to keep you. This, for me, is a very symbolic nature of the way in which the Iranian state has developed over the last 100 years. This is an unfinished statue of Reza Shah. I think it's in Neo-Iran. It is, isn't it? Yeah. And I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. They just left it there after the revolution. Incomplete. Brilliant. His boots. Yeah, it's brilliant. For me, it's the greatest metaphor for modern Iran ever made, and it's basically the incompleteness of it all. And you'll see what I want to go and talk about afterwards. But first of all, let's just go through this in rapid order, if I may. One is inheritance. Okay? They have inherited, yes, a sort of a developed idea of Iran and a developed idea of the state going back several hundred years. Okay? What I mean by that is in Iran you don't get the same tradition as you might get in the Ottoman Empire or others of it being a dynastic state. You're not Mughal India, it's not the Ottoman Empire. Iran is actually, by the 17th century, is talking of itself as a state, the state of Iran. The dynasty is secondary to that. Yeah? And that's quite interesting. It follows a pattern which is quite different. What it means is that there's an inheritance there that is quite profound. Not simply in terms of identity, but also in terms of the state. Okay, and then if you want to go into the sort of the period of the Islamic Republic, that's true of that too. Almost every dynastic successor in Iran always claims that it starts from scratch. The most famous one being, of course, is the way the Sasanians effectively whitewashed the Parthians out of history. The Parthians ruled Iran for 500 years. They get, I think, 3 pages in the Book of Kings. They're all over it, by the way, if you know what you're looking for. But the fact is, they're the party kings. They're the sort of a waste of time. Okay? And yet, if you look at Sasanian history, by the way, the Sasanians owe a lot more to the Parthians than they would certainly admit in official documents. But it's the same here. Almost everyone builds on layers of others. If you want to be, if you want to pare things right back, you can say what my old colleague Bert Fragner used to say, that modern Iran is really a creation of the Mongols. Now, what does he mean by that? Most Iranians will have a heart attack if I said that. What do you mean the Mongols? But what he's really meaning is that the distinct state, a separate state in Iran, a political society, distinct from the rest of the Islamic world, really becomes solidified, consolidated after the Mongols. The Mongols basically make that break. And it's in the literary tradition that emerges there from the bureaucrats who govern the Mongol Empire and afterwards that you get the development of Iran Zamin, and the idea of Iran comes back in a much, much more powerful sense. And that leads into the Safavids. And the Safavids then, of course, bring in Shia Islam. But what were the Safavids? Were the Safavids a religious state? Were the Safavids a totalitarian state, as Roger Savory used to say? No. They certainly weren't a totalitarian state. And as for Shiism, by the way, here's the interesting thing. The Safavids are the one post-conquest, Islamic conquest dynasty that actually uses throne names that come from the Shahnameh. But of course nobody ever sees that, because we don't want to see it, because they're a Shia state. Shah Tahmasp is not a Muslim name. Yeah? What does it tell you? If you dig a bit deeper, you'll see, again, as I said to you right at the beginning, there are 2 traditions. Of course, they are championing Shiism and they are championing a particular brand of Islam. But next to that, they are living the good life of a good Persian king who derives his sort of understanding, mythology and history from the Shahnameh. And their personal names, by the way, are not by and large Muslim. Bahman, Bahram, Behzad. Yeah? These are all Persian names. When they take the throne, they then adopt their Muslim throne name. But the Safavids are the one exception to that, you see, of course. It's quite interesting. So that inheritance is a dual inheritance, and I think we need to be aware of that. When Agha Muhammad Khan, the founder of the Qajar dynasty, brutally, because they all do it brutally, by the way, brutally establishes his dynasty, and when would it be? The 1790s. Let's say he starts in 1785. I mean, it depends by the time. What does he do? First of all, we know from the writings that when he sends his troops in to fight the Russians, he has people reading the Shahnameh to them to encourage them to fight. It's very Turkish of him. It's very Muslim of him. Yeah. When he crowns himself, what does he do? He invents a crown. Obviously, he doesn't think he invents a crown, he thinks he discovered it or something, but invents a crown, it's the Khayanid crown. What's the Khayanid crown? The Khayanid crown is the crown of the Sasanians. We seem to have a difficulty in the modern world of thinking that people can have several identities. Of course he's Turkic, yeah? Of course he's a Muslim and a Shia, but there's also a very strong strand of Persianism in him. Okay? And these inheritances go through, and you can see that. It's not a creation of the Pahlavis. The Pahlavis didn't invent this stuff. It's much, much deeper. When Nader Shah, who I showed you earlier, takes the throne, when does he take the throne again? 1736. 1736, he has a coin minted. And the coin says, Nader, world conqueror, king of Iran, Zamin, the land of Iran. You don't put that on a coronation coin if you don't mean it, yeah? Okay, it's not, do you know what I mean? But you'll be amazed at the number of people who are, it's not important. He was a Turkish warlord bandit. Was he? Or are you just ignoring the evidence that doesn't suit your narrative, yeah? So what I'm saying is look at that. The European challenge is enormously important because the European challenge brings in ideas of modernity, and I use that term in a qualified sense, but nonetheless that challenge of Europe is a challenge that Iran finds quite difficult to deal with because the Europeans are not just coming with military, political or economic strength, they're coming with a new ideology, and the ideology needs to be contained, developed, absorbed, adapted, and that's what they do. Much more engagement with the Europeans than you'd think. If you read the standard history books, the Europeans were just there to plunder. Not saying they weren't, by the way, but the fact is the engagement was also very serious. There were Iranians travelling to Britain, writing accounts of it, working out what this nationalism business is about, patriotism, how do we excite people in our own country. And what they actually developed, interestingly enough, if you read the narratives throughout the 19th century, and Daniel will love this obviously, is a thoroughly Whiggish history. I mean the most Whiggish history that you could ever imagine. You read the histories of Britain by Persian scholars who come here. They've obviously been supping at Palmerston's table. And in one case, I know that a couple of them were guests of Palmerston. Okay, and you can almost see where they've lifted stuff. But they're fascinated by it. They're fascinated by newspapers. They're fascinated by industry. So it's not armies and this, that thing that excites them. What they're fascinated by is development. So again, this European challenge is absorbed, and it's this European challenge at the end of the day that comes into fruition in 1906 with the Constitutional Revolution. To my mind, you can't understand modern Iran without the Constitutional Revolution in 1906. The Constitutional Revolution is what transforms the country in a political sense and sets the template for political development for then on in. It's not successful in a practical sense, but it's enormously influential in an ideological sense. And what does the Constitution of 1906 deliver? It delivers, as the name suggests, the Constitution, a parliament, a separation of powers, restriction on the powers of the monarchy, a franchise. I don't want to call it democracy, but it's a republic in the 19th century sense of the term. It's meant to be a political state founded on laws. For the first time, it recognizes the religious minorities, Jews, Zoroastrians, Christians. It doesn't recognize the Baha'is. Okay, remain the persecuted minority really in Iran par excellence. But the Baha'is, by the way, and their precursors, the Babi movement, which was a religious revolution in the mid-19th century, was extremely important in shattering the orthodoxy of the 19th century Iranian state and the calm and complacency of it. Okay, and the Babi movement, which was a millenarian movement and sought to overthrow religious law in that sense, has that good effect of saying all things are possible. We can think the unthinkable. They are obviously savagely persecuted, as is always the case, but the Babis and the Baha'is subsequently, I think, have an enormous influence in the thinking that goes on. Okay? So 1906 is enormously important. But 1906 fails for the very simple reason because a lot of very, very well-meaning liberals who come in, they are very liberal. They are very, very liberal. And they say sovereignty, actually say sovereignty belongs to the people. It's an extraordinary thing to say. Yeah? Let's get rid of these clerics. Let's get on with it. We want free education, free this, free that, nationwide, judicial systems, this, that, and the other. What they realise, however, is they can't do it because there isn't anything to work with. It's all very well and good saying I want free education around the country, but where do you start? Remember what I said to you last week about the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Revolution inheriting the Pahlavi state? This is the key, by the way. And you can read the accounts of people at the time. It's fascinating to see them. They say, we wanted to set up a nationwide education system. We wanted to set up a new judiciary and a legal system. But where do you start when you don't have any teachers, lawyers, codes of law, judges? Well, you don't even have a standardized language. Where do you start? Okay? So what happens is, after 15 years of agony, excuse me for the abbreviation of this, but I've written about this quite a bit, so you're very welcome to go and purchase at a discount. What they decide then is they say, what we need, before we can have a constitutional system that's functional, we need a government. Sort of basic policy, yeah? So in order to be able to restrict the government, we need a government, we need institutions, we need to build it. So what do? We look at the European example. It's there, by the way, it's all in the literature. They say, what we need is an enlightened despot. Enlightened despot can come and do it. Could do with a Napoleon, but I don't think we can do with a Napoleon because we're not really there yet. What we need is a Peter the Great. And they actually say Peter the Great, bad choice, but hell, let's go for, as enlightened despots go, let's go for Peter the Great. And why do they want Peter the Great? Because they say Peter the Great is just the sort of person who can push through a degree of modernization, a pace that we need, including things like changing dress codes, shaving beards, and all the other stuff. They find, as their savior, by the way, the commander of the Cossack Brigade, Peter the Great, as I said. The Russians had disappeared in the war because of the Russian Revolution. The Persian officers take over the control of the Cossack Brigade, and one gentleman, this chap Reza Khan, who then becomes Reza Shah, becomes the leader, in a sense, of a group of people who seek to establish proper governance in the country. And really, to my mind, the period from 1921 through to 41, and really further on, is this sort of constitutional era. It's a constitutional era in which those main aspects of the constitutional movement that have been gestating, by the way, for 100 years before that, come to fruition in 1906, come to a stuttering halt, then from 1921 onwards, with the sort of the iron fist. I said that the intellectuals that supported Reza Shah with a velvet glove around his iron fist. I thought it was quite a nice phrase myself, but there you are. But he was an iron fist, by the way. Yeah? To basically push through the state building that was required. So the state is built in a period of about 15 years. Okay? And what you do get is you do have an educational system, the foundation of the University of Tehran in 1934, a judicial system, forged at breakneck speed, I have to say. They adopt penal codes and other law codes from European countries. They send people abroad to study law. Okay? Now, the problem here in the Pahlavi experiment, the Pahlavi achievement, I think the Pahlavi achievement is pretty dramatic. Okay? But where I think the problem lies is this. If I'm looking at it coming up to the Islamic Republic, which we'll look in more depth later. But I want you to sort of really appreciate this historical inheritance. The original constitutionalists, basically drawing from a narrative of the Enlightenment, a particular narrative of the Enlightenment from the 19th century, argue that what you need is political and economic reform. You cannot have one without the other. Because economic development must occur within a political framework. And what do they mean by political framework? They mean a legal framework, an institutional framework. Okay? What happens under Reza Shah, before his unceremonious dismissal in 1941 during the Second World War, is that he essentially builds up the institutions of the state, but he doesn't really develop the concomitant institutions of society and civil society. Because for Reza Shah, what he's interested in is a powerful state. And by the time he departs in 1941, as it says here, the state is incomplete. Okay, you have half the equation done. I mean, I have to say, in the period of time we're looking at, it's pretty rapid. Okay, so a lot of things would not have settled. Remember, again, I'm saying to you, if you think about it in different layers. Yeah, what does state and society, how does it operate? We'll get onto society in a minute. But this idea is that basically he's trying to change a mode of political organisation. It's going to take time, obviously, to seep in. But the critical factor is it's incomplete. His son, who comes in, 1941 to 79, Mohammad Reza Shah, picks up the economic pace at some rapidity. And one of the great distinctions of this period, of course, is that what happens under Mohammad Reza Shah is economic development takes priority over political development. And you get very rapid economic growth, even social development, education, others explodes under, the foundations that are set under Reza Shah are basically, they shoot off under Mohammad Reza Shah. But the one thing that the son forgets to do is to complete the legacy of the constitutional revolution in terms of political institutional reform. And a critical factor in that, by the way, is the development of the law. Iran in the 1970s had about 3,000 lawyers. Okay, we all might think it's great to have less lawyers in society, but if you're going to have a functional constitutional system and legal system, you need functionaries to be able to operate it. And if you have 3,000 lawyers for a population of 38 million, most of whom aren't interested in practicing law, by the way, there was an American study of it at the time, that said most of the lawyers are actually busy having lunch and negotiating compromises, but they're not actually practicing law. But why are they not practicing law? Because the law doesn't seem to function, because the Shah hasn't really developed it enough. Okay, so keep that in mind about, when the revolution happens, the revolution inherits a state. And quite a powerful state in many ways. But it doesn't, one of the problems that the Shah did is he didn't develop the concomitant civil society that might match that. The restrictions on the state in that sense. The state becomes very, very powerful. But it isn't matched by that civil society element, that sort of, that balancing, if you will. So, I know it's a bit late now, but we will do this more next week as well. I just want to go through this because I think this is, when we're looking at a sort of a conceptual understanding, it informs my own opinion, okay? And I just want to see where I'm coming from, so you know where you're coming from. Marx and Weber, two of the great sort of thinkers, sociologists, political philosophers, political thinkers, that understand or model change, and they understand modernization and modernity in different ways. Okay? Both writers are quite popular in Iran, you'll be pleased to know, so in case anyone wants to come out with any sort of accusations of Orientalism, you can relax. Yeah? Both writers are quite popular. And they're used and abused. I mean, like all thinkers, by the way, they're plundered relentlessly for particular things that might apply to them, but nobody actually necessarily reads the whole thing. Nobody's read Das Kapital from cover to cover, let's be honest about it. But a few of them will have read the Communist Manifesto. They're very fond on Gramsci as well. The Modern Prince is quite a popular text in Iran. Not for all the right reasons, but nonetheless, well, actually for the right reason, for dissident opinion. Okay, but Gramsci was translated in Iran into Persian in the 1960s, which is probably a decade before it was translated here. Okay, so I'm not saying, by the way, that means it was widespread, but I'm just saying that if I'm looking at Marx and Weber, I think that these two critical thinkers, and their offshoots, by the way, I think are quite interesting when we look at it. Okay, there are two things really I want us to think about here in terms of the structure of the state. And incidentally, why I think they work together, I borrow shamelessly from Brian Turner on Weber and Islam, who basically says that Weber and Marx are complementary, they're not contradictory. And they're complementary. Why? Because Marx tends to look from the ground up, Weber tends to look from the top down. Weber is talking about authority, bureaucracy. Marx is looking at social and economic change from the bottom. I'm not saying, by the way, that all their ideas are of enormous relevance to what we're looking at in Iran, but what I think about them, what I think is that they can offer us a way to understand the way in which the state has developed. And because the Iranian political thinkers themselves use it, it's a legitimate way to do it. Okay? How do we understand the pre-modern state, or the state in Iran? I think there are three ideas of Weber that are relevant to us in terms of traditional authority and charismatic authority. Both patriarchalism, patrimonialism, and charisma. Patrimonialism is the one that dominates. But patrimonialism, of course, under Weber requires a large bureaucracy. And in Raja Iran, certainly in the 19th century, we did not have a large bureaucracy. So you could argue it's more patriarchal than patrimonial. But it's very personal government. It's personal government based on a principle of divide and rule. And the more dominant that individual becomes, the more weak, paradoxically, it becomes, because the more dependent he is on those officials doing his bidding. And the last thing he wants, by the way, is unity. Okay, you've got to keep things divided. One of the reasons why Raja Iran had longevity is not because the state was strong. It's because society was weak. Okay, so we have to bear that in mind. So when everyone says to you, "Oh, the state in Iran is very strong today," I say, "Well, is it strong, or is it because society hasn't organised? Is it because we're at the 17th sun and not the 18th? Yeah. What happens when society suddenly springs into action? What do you do then? Do you have the capacity to deal with them? Again, I'm just throwing these out to you. But this social atomization and cohesion is also something very pivotal in Marxian understandings of society. So Marx, interesting enough, and always makes me laugh. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's well worth reading. Abrahamian's article on Oriental Despotism and Raja Iran is a great article. Great, I think 1976. Stood the test of time. Principally because it says Marx and Engels went to learn Persian and Arabic. Engels was learning Arabic and was dying and complained to Marx that this is so bloody difficult, I don't know why I even started. And Marx is saying, actually, you should try Persian, it's a doddle. But both of them come away with the realization that their attempt to apply their theories into Iran are not going to work because there's no evidence. There's nothing for them to work with in that sense. But what they do argue with, or what Marx does suggest, and this is one of the arguments I think Abrahamian brings, is he says the reason why the Raja state is able to survive so long and to sustain itself and to manage and to negotiate is because society is atomized. There's a division, and they haven't been able to coalesce. And this, of course, fits in rather well with patrimonialism. Patrimonialism, of course, encourages that division. It has to. It's part of its raison d'etre, otherwise it won't survive. Yeah? Autocracy has to do that to an element. There are, to quote a sort of a phrase among medievalists, whereas European society is horizontal, Middle Eastern societies are vertical, or Eastern societies. I mean, I know these are very simplistic, but it's this idea of, how you look. You don't have guilds in that. It's not entirely true, but you don't have that sort of class-based system. Even a transnational system of some sort. Yeah, what you have actually is loyalties are going, up the ladder. And it's your role as the ruler to ensure that none of your minions are thinking about getting together and joining together and banding together to cause you hassle. You have to create division. So that social atomization is important. So what you have in terms of, as I said, in terms of layering the modern state, is look at that in terms of what do you have in terms of the Iranian state in the Raja Iran. It's a very basic system. There isn't a bureaucracy, there isn't an army. There's a system of negotiation, there's a system of patriarchal stroke patrimonial links and negotiation among family members. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Agha Muhammad Khan, who I mentioned to you, the founder of the Raja dynasty, was a eunuch. So that makes founding a dynasty a bit difficult. I won't go into the details of how he became a eunuch, it's pretty unpleasant, but there you are. If anyone has an excuse of a difficult childhood for being brutal, it's him. Okay, so he's castrated at a fairly young age. That's an act of mercy. Okay, so think about it. His nephew, Fath Ali Shah, on the other hand, compensates for this by having so many offspring, he can populate the elite. He basically creates a patriarchal system. We estimate he has 60 sons and 300 daughters. It's a good going. Okay, so he creates a tribe. Okay, from given several generations. Okay, if anyone comes and tells you that they're a Raja prince, say, yeah, okay. All right, it's there are far too many of them. But that functioning of the state is then added to in the Constitutional Revolution with the development of state institutions. Okay, and those state institutions are then economically empowered from the 1960s and 70s onwards. But never forget the underlying myths and political myths that shape all that. I'm just asking you, it's a very complicated web. Web is maybe the wrong term, but you know what I mean, layered. I mean, think about it in that sense. When I went back in the first lecture, I think, to talk about Deaton, who said that historians are much better at multi-causal and multi-layered. This is what I mean. Yeah? And they all combine in some ways with each other. There is great tension between tradition and modernity, probably best exemplified by the Islamic Republic of Iran. You can't get a better name for a state, can you really? The Islamic Republic of Iran. Tradition, modernity. Eastern, Western. There's no concept of republic in Islam. Yeah? The republican system, as they've devised it, is purely a Western construction, which they've tried to reconcile. But that tension between tradition and modernity is there. Now, the final bit that I want you to think about going forward, and we'll see when we get, obviously, to the Islamic Republic, because I don't want to, is the whole notion of mercantile capitalism. And this is my idea, if you will, that I think hasn't really been, I think, fully digested for its implications. And this is the part of Marx that I like. Because when Marx talks about, so what does Weber talk about development? He says a patrimonial system can, over time, through the process of charisma, it's punctuated by charisma, charismatic leadership, can lead to a modern system, a legal rational model. It can do. Okay, most people miss that bit out in his book, but he does say it. So there's a sort of a linear progression. It can happen. Marx is a slightly more basic in terms of linear progression, but it's quite interesting nonetheless. And I think what for me is quite striking about when you're understanding Iran is the marriage between the patrimonial authority and the mercantile system of capitalism. Because when I used to go to Iran in the 1990s, everyone used to say to me, they're very capitalist here, they all like money. And businessmen would flow in from the West. and all the right terms would be used. Yeah? But it soon became apparent to me, and it soon became apparent to many businessmen, that the words they were using meant different things. They weren't talking about the same thing at all. They were talking about different things. And the difference, in my view, is the difference between mercantile capitalism and industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism is what we have predominantly, not exclusively, predominantly in the West. And what does industrial capitalism mean? For Marx, industrial capitalism is the real revolutionary force. It's the real revolutionary force in development. It requires investment. Capital is put into production. You produce and then you trade. You add value. You build things. And it unleashes a certain sort of resource base that allows you to do things that pre-industrial states can't do. Mercantile capitalism, for Marx, is exemplified by the Italian city-states of the 16th, 15th and 16th century. What is it? Trade predominates. Mercantile exchange. Short-term. Volatile. You want a high rate of, you're not waiting for 10 years to get a return on your investment. I'm not hanging around for that. I need it now. I need it quickly. And the higher the profit margin, the better. In fact, if I can fiddle it, even better. You marry a patrimonial system that is not a legal system with a mercantile form of capital formation, and you've got a recipe for kleptocracy. Yeah? And the reason I like the idea of mercantile capitalism as opposed to the rentier state that you'll get in a lot of textbooks is because for me, what mercantile capitalism is about is a way of thinking. I don't want to say it's a class of, I don't want to say it's the merchants, the bazaar. No, it's a way of thinking. And their way of thinking is short-term, volatile, and in the interest of making a quick buck. Why do they want to do that? Because, lo and behold, the political system is unstable. It's not legal. I could be arrested any day. So the best thing I need to do is to make as much money as quickly as I possibly can, and ideally get it abroad, or into some safe haven. That works in my favour, of course, because the more money I send abroad, the more the real collapses, so when I go abroad to Geneva and pick up a few dollars, I can spend lavishly when I come back to Iran. There is a vicious, depreciating cycle about this system. If you looked at mercantile capital or patrimonialism on its own, you can chart a path to a developing sort of position. If you combine them, they work to basically hinder each other. What I'll do next week is I will then, hopefully with the finale, go into the Islamic Republic as a consequence of this. Not only the inheritance, but this political economy at work. And what I'll try and show you is that this notion of volatility is inbuilt into the system. Do you see what I'm getting at? And sometimes they can do it very well, by the way. People say, well, they can do it. Of course they can. They know how to manage it. I used to remember talking to people when they said that, after Iraq, and they said the Iranians had moved into Iraq, but the whole system is chaotic. I said, you don't understand, though. You want to establish order. They love the chaos. I was told off by someone saying chaos is the wrong word, and I entirely agree. I'm not saying that chaos is, it gives the wrong impression, but at least I'm trying to get that point across that it is in contradistinction to what we would expect. We want to go and set up a legal framework, a rules-based framework, something that's transparent. They don't want it to be transparent. How are you going to make lots of money very quickly without anyone noticing if anything's transparent? Yeah? So I'll explain a lot of these. I hope I've managed to go. That's the key, by the way. Okay, the key to an understanding of the modern Iranian state is to see those layers. Understand in terms of political action where the myths and mythology and myths of emancipation come from, but then in terms of the structure of the state, 1906 is pivotal. You can't get away from it. If you ignore it, you're losing a major part of your argument. The Pahlavi development, particularly economic development, is vital, but it is economic and not political. And what it tends to do is basically continue a system of political organisation that basically existed from the 19th century onwards, in which we all were, of course. Mercantile capitalism was the norm. But for those of you who are sort of like quick on the ball on this, what I'm basically saying is that the Iranian state is a pre-modern state. And pre-modern states are inherently unstable.